This week, Casey Ellis from Bug Crowd is with us to discuss 5G hackathons and all things bug bounty. Stay tuned for Below the Surface.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
Welcome to Below the Surface, episode number 28, being recorded on Wednesday, April 24th, 2024. Well, we're recording before that, but you're hearing this on Wednesday, April 24th, 2024. I'm your host, Paul Asadorian, joined by Mr. Alan Alford. Alan, welcome.
Howdy, and thank you.
Good to have you here, my friend. As always, Below the Surface listeners can learn more about Eclipsium by visiting eclipsium.com/go. There you will find the ultimate guide to supply chain security, an on-demand webinar I presented called Unraveling Digital Supply Chain Threats and Risk, a paper on the relationship between ransomware and the supply chain, a customer case study with DigitalOcean. And if you're interested in seeing our product in action, you can sign up for a demo by going to eclipsium.com/go. Today, we're talking about 5G hackathons, and we're, of course, excited to have Mr. Casey Ellis, the founder and chief strategy officer at Bug Crowd, with us today. Casey's the founder, and again, the chief strategy officer today at Bug Crowd. Also, the co-founder of Disclose.io and a 20-plus year veteran of information security. You can hear his Hacker Heroes episode where Casey and I spent a lot of time just chatting, getting to know Casey on air. So, Casey, it's good to have you on Below the Surface.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, what is this 5G hackathon that I'm told happened pretty recently, right?
Yeah, that's right. It was the week of the 8th of February. So the front end of February up in Seattle. And yeah, basically, I mean, Bug Crowd's been running live hacking events. The first one that we ran was actually in 2013 with OWASP in New York. It was, kind of at that point in time, the idea of like, what if we had a CTF on bug bounty targets and did that whole thing. And that kind of evolved into something that we realized that the market actually really wants. So the opportunity to have, hackers come in and do their thing, like live in the room with folk from the product teams, folk from the security teams, folk from whichever other parts of the target organization in that same room, and obviously the Bug Crowd.
So it's like a purple hackathon.
Kind of, yeah. It's. I mean, the thing that I kind of like about them the best at this point in time is it's pretty much everything that we do on the platform, but like a compressed like IRL version of it. So like all of the stuff that goes on in terms of interaction, discovery, like the feedback, the back and forth, all those good things, that all happens in the room. And it's a lot of fun. But yeah, the one that we just ran in February was really focused on 5G infrastructure. It was with T-Mobile, and there was some other targets and different things that we were kind of working on. But the 5G component of it, as far as we can tell, it's the first time that there's been an event like that run in that kind of way. And obviously, it was pretty exciting to start to dig into that stuff a bit more seriously.
Yeah. What? I guess two-part question. Like, why 5G, and why are people kind of freaked out about 5G security?
Yeah, I mean, Wi-5G. It's obviously I think where telco is kind of going from like a backhaul and just a general communication standpoint. The ubiquity of it, globally at this point is continuing to increase. So like just logically, at some point you've got to tear it apart and see what's up from a security standpoint. There's definitely some interesting kind of geopolitical kind of overtones with 5G and making sure that there's confidence and assurance around, security of encryption, security of the actual RANs and the infrastructure itself, all that kind of stuff. There's, as much a confidence story that's wanting to be told as there is like legitimate discovery of security issues so they can be fixed. And yeah, I mean, why now? Really, I think the answer to that question is kind of why not? Like it's like the best time to do it is now, and not having done it before. It's that was the conversation that we started up with T-Mobile probably 6 months ago, when they came to us with this idea. It's like, yeah, cool, let's get it together. Let's get the right kind of people in the room and go for it. The other thing as well, like the actual event, you can see it on some of the the clips and videos and whatnot that we've started to share. They've actually got a really cool basically 5G tech hub, it's called, which is essentially this hacker space that they have up in Bellevue, I think it is. That's kitted out with all of the right kind of radio kits, so you can do interception, man in the middle, looking at the backhaul at the same time as you're looking at the handset, all those kind of things that are a little bit more difficult to do unless you've got like a testing space that's set up fit for purpose. So we wanted to make use of that as well.
Yeah, you mentioned the right people, Alan. You had a question along those lines.
Yeah, you kind of alluded to bringing the right people in and having them there for the right reasons. Like, can you elaborate on that? Like, I want to drill in a little bit about the different roles and what their part was they played. It's to Paul's point, it's bigger than just a purple kind of thing. Can you walk us through that in detail?
Yeah, so when I'm talking about the right people, I'm talking specifically about the people that we invite. Like hackers on our platform, like what we've really built as a company at this point in time. I like to describe it as like Match.com for people that break computers, in a sense.
Nice.
So we're trying to understand what the traits are of the target, of the technology environment, like what are the overall kind of, what does a bad day look like for them? And then how can we match that with the traits of the people on the supply side that we end up inviting to events like these, regardless of whether they're in person or virtual, it's kind of the same process, to make sure that we can create impact and discover, as efficiently as possible the kind of things that might be available to be found in a system like that. And obviously with hardware, it's interesting because I think, bug bounty as a space is mostly known for web application security, which is not for no reason. I think that's kind of the broadest population of hackers on the internet at this point in time are pretty specialized on kind of the web components of offensive security. But that's not to say that that's the only thing. I think it's kind of common by volume and not necessarily by impact. So what we're doing is we're going out and finding folk that have demonstrated experience messing about with radio, for example. There's far fewer of those folk available to choose from. We want to have someone like that, couple them with someone who understands baseband or operating systems or firmware or things that happen on a low level on like an OT or a kind of an infrastructure embedded appliance, as well as folks that understand cloud and all of the different things that might be happening from an API standpoint. What's really fun about these events from a live hacking standpoint is that you do tend to see groups sort of self-organize. Like you'll have the radio guy says, oh, I've got a problem with like Kubernetes and I've never hacked that before. So someone who has that experience sort of walks over and it's like this Voltron assemble thing happens kind of in real time in the room, which is quite fun to watch.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
What were so from a T-Mobile perspective, like what were their goals? What were they hoping to get out of it?
Yeah, vulnerabilities, honestly. Like that's the that was the biggest thing, is to make sure that they're getting a good whack of findings out of the event that they can go off and work on, and they can go off and work with their partners to resolve as well, because obviously not all of the infrastructure is stuff that they're actually manufacturing themselves. There's obviously supply chains that come into this and all that kind of stuff, and there was some of those folk in the room as well. That was the primary goal. I think the secondary goal was really to kind of demonstrate and make a bit of a splash, internally, to actually show what it looks like when hackers walk into a room and start, collaborating with people within the organization. Because we're still, I feel like we've come a long way over the past 12 years in terms of people understanding that hackers can be helpful and not just harmful, but it is still a story that you need to tell, as often and as effectively as you can. So just to be able to have an executive walk into the room and see it, like that's, oh wow, okay, cool. Like I didn't think it'd look quite like this. This is actually really cool. Like these are normal people. I can get in and have a conversation, start the jam, all those different things. So there was an internal marketing component to it, and then the external marketing component as well. T-Mobile are wanting to tell the story of being proactive around using offensive security as a part of how they secure themselves and how they continue to roll forward. So I think that was a goal there as well.
Was there so recently someone was asking about the supply chain component with respects to 5G, specifically calling out the cranes in the shipping ports that they found to have 5G modems, and they were like, "Well, how do you find all that stuff?" I'm like, "Well, usually there's a computer component to a larger thing,
Yep.
right? It's not necessarily like you got to inspect the entire crane." So I guess my real question, Casey, is: was there like a supply chain component to it where the hackers kind of looked at the chipsets and what was on the board and went, "Are you expecting it to have all of these components, or was that like not part of it?"
That definitely came into it.
Hmm.
Like obviously, there's some of these things are still in flight from a fixed standpoint, so I have to be a little
Sure.
a
Yeah.
little
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
little
Yeah.
careful in how I talk about some of it. But yeah, there was definitely folk looking into things like if you've got a volatile memory component to a particular device, like is that volatile memory, which is probably made by a third party that has absolutely nothing to do with 5G or telcos,
Mm,
is there a vulnerability or anything that's exploitable on that particular system that could be used as a stepping stone for an attack? That sort of research definitely goes on. I mean, I think we saw that kind of work going into this. What was fun about this event, and this does happen when we do like hardware events, like we've run live hacking
hmm.
events on like vehicles, on ATMs, on all sorts of kind of difficult to ship equipment, because that is one of the reasons that you can do stuff like this, getting people physically to a target that would otherwise be hard to get a hold of.
Hmm.
That's the thing that happens. But oftentimes what you'll see happen is once they realize what the target's going to be, they'll jump on eBay and they'll look for
Yeah.
aftermarket versions of the same thing, start to tear those things apart. um, that's when a lot of the supply chain stuff tends to fall out, because they're like, hey, these all have the same CF card, or volatile memory,
Hmm.
um, as an example that I used before, or whatever else it might be. That's kind of when that research starts to happen. It's actually before the event. And then
Right.
during the event itself, they'll dig into the middleware and all
I
those different
gotcha.
things, because they got the right people in the room.
Yeah, I was reminded of when the Nest thermostats first came out, and hackers started looking at them like, "Hey, did you know there's a Zigbee chip in here, and it's not really being used, but the hardware is in there, right?" I think it reminded me in the 5G context that that's a thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a thing just generally in a
Hmm.
hardware context, especially if you've got systems that are being built on top of commodity or kind of multi-purpose compute. This like Halva talks about the anomaly of cheap complexity, and how that
Hmm.
creates an attack surface, because you've got ultimately these very specialized systems being built on top of stuff that's able to do kind of anything. So if you haven't turned off the things that aren't relevant to the mission of that particular product, you can end up with attack surface that you didn't mean to have. That's definitely a thing, and I don't think that's
Right.
limited to 5G necessarily.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Because I mean, these components aren't necessarily 100% specialty purpose built across the
Right.
board, right?
yeah,
There's some commodity to it, in other words.
correct. And some are like, if you're talking about, it's interesting in this particular space. It's similar in some ways to automotive, because you've got the OEMs that are building out head units and different things like that. They're very specific in their design, and you've usually got kind of built for purpose boards that aren't necessarily specific to a particular end user, but they're specific to that particular kind of area of mission, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
So you're not talking about like a Intel NUC PCB that's being used to push packets on a 5G RAN. Like, it
Yeah,
is a little
yeah.
bit more specialized than that, but you do see some of these, like, what's that thing doing there? Like, that definitely does come up.
Right.
Yeah.
Alan, you had a question about scope.
Yeah, so this is great that we just covered a bunch of these other exercises, ATMs and cars and cranes and all these things, but specific to the 5G, what was your scope? How did you dig in? Did you get into the chips? Did you already mentioned you had radio. The old switch networks versus the IP. Is there still switch stuff on the back end that you guys are playing with? Like, give me the full scope.
Yeah, no, for sure. So essentially, what, like, the scope of the overall event, there was there was web hackers and folk working on mobile apps in the room as well. So there was like a Stardot kind of open scope piece happening. There was a particular application that was in scope. That was a mobile app that people were banging on, and then there was this whole hardware component. So on the hardware side, really the way that we set the program up was to basically create a bunch of different scenarios. And for some of those scenarios, there's a over the air version of the exploit as well as a local version of the exploit. So that'd be kind of divided up into what attack vector could you use to actually trigger this version of a bad day, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
And that's a lot of how we incentivized the security research that was going into hardware. Um, at this particular event. So yeah, there's switching downstream, there's controllers, there's the actual radio controllers themselves, there's the radios themselves, there's it's a pretty it like reminded me a lot of industrial control systems that I've seen, where you've got these kind of multiple layers of supervisory kind of control, and it gets like more and more kind of resilient as a target, and more kind of specific to mission the closer, like the further out you get from that kind of control unit. But there's all of your traditional bits and pieces in the background, in terms of just traditional like IPv4 attack vectors. If you can insert a DHCP packet in the wrong way, like can you get something to talk to something that's not supposed to? All those kind of traditional, almost like old school at this point network type attacks. So they were all kind of in scope, and some of them were successful.
Yeah, could this extend beyond T-Mobile? I know you probably couldn't say necessarily, but it's feasible to assume that a protocol that was in scope and or like you said, like DHCP or whatever, could be applicable to another vendor, another network, another implementation of it, right?
Yeah, I mean, some of those types of attacks and some of those types of outcomes are more kind of like a water is wet problem. It's like trying to solve BGP. It's like, yeah, BGP is inherently fragile in certain ways, and that's just a function of how it was built. So you can't, like, proving that it's vulnerable, there's not necessarily any benefit to that on its own, unless of course you've got a particular way that so back to DHCP and different things that are more relevant to this area. If you've got particular ways that this has been kind of prescribed to be deployed, that are inherently vulnerable, like can you adjust those? For example, it's like, don't set it up in a way that allows different things to happen on the network that might just be a function of how networks work, but might have a security consequence that wasn't necessarily considered when that documentation for implementation was written in the first place. Like that sort of thing can come up quite a lot with these sort of OEM, to kind of master vendor relationships, and there was a few of those that popped out for sure.
How do we scale? Like, I love this so much. I'm going to ask the question, like, how do we scale it, right? Because there's so many companies that are very similar to the T-Mobile model, where they're getting software and hardware from third parties, putting it all together, and then bringing it to market. And this is obviously very specialized security testing. In your mind, Casey, how are you thinking about scaling that?
Yeah, I think the closer we can get to the OEMs, the better. Because you're kind of getting to the source, right? Like to me, if there's work that's done at the kind of the source, hardware level, then like logically the security benefit of that work propagates out to all of the end users of that equipment. So that to me is one answer to that question. And we've seen that, definitely going back to what I was saying before about automotive security and some of the other areas where we've done like physical hardware testing. That's kind of how we've approached that. So I think that's definitely an approach that can work. Yeah, the other thing I would say is just kind of promoting the fact that this is possible. Like there are outcomes. This is a good thing. Like there was definitely through the course of the the 3 or 4 days that we're actually running this event. And this is completely normal. It's got nothing to do with the people in the room, but there's this sense of like, oh my gosh, you can't do that, to like, oh no, that's not really happening, to, oh, okay, we've got to go off and fix these things. Katie Mo talks about the 5 stages of vulnerability grief, and you kind of sometimes get to see that in real time at events like this one. Right. And there was examples of that. There's people like, oh wow, hang on a sec, I didn't even realize that was a thing. And then going through like the bargaining and the denial to the acceptance to, okay, now what are we going to do about this? And how do we actually make this repeatable, kind of to your question, so that we can find other things that we might need to fix in the future? I think the fact that that's how this works, and that's a good thing, ultimately, I think telling that story is kind of important, because there is still definitely this element of like ostrich risk management that exists in industrial security, like enterprise security, industrial security, when it comes to hardware. Like they just kind of sometimes don't want to know or want to be kind of willfully ignorant of the problem, because if it hasn't caused a problem to date, maybe it never will. But we all know on the offensive side that like with enough time between now and the heat death of the universe, everyone gets owned. So it's better to get ahead of it, right?
But that's not how we
I mean, I
designed
kind of
it,
liken it
right?
to the Right. But I kinda liken to, like, when you first started writing code and you share that with a more senior developer, and you're like, "Oh, man," right? Like, you go through those stages of grief, and the first time you hand it off to
Yeah,
QA, it's a very similar kinda thing, but then you get used to it. You're like,
yeah.
"Oh, I'm gonna develop code," and then it you realize that it becomes a positive thing, and that's what I hope we can instill on the OEMs and
I
T-Mobiles of the
I
world,
think that's right.
is it's a positive
Yeah,
thing.
absolutely. I think T-Mobile definitely has already kind of gotten that memo, and I think other folk
Mm,
that, because ultimately I think a lot of the pressure on this type of work is actually being driven by the consumer. Because like at this point in time, you've got a consumer that doesn't necessarily understand what's going on, but they're aware of the fact that security matters to them, and they want to
mhm.
see things that seem tangible and real, on the part of whoever they're a customer of, that makes them feel like their risk is being handled in this area. So I think the closer you are to that side of things, the more likely you are to already get this. It's the folk that are further back that need you know that kind of need the evangelism,
Yeah.
frankly, at this point. Um,
It's interesting though, Case, you make it sound like consumers are security driven. Is that are you observing kind of that trend that more and more that's becoming a factor when
yeah,
we choose technology and providers?
I think it is like it would be a little, it'd be overly optimistic to say that it's like the thing. But if you're talking
Mm,
about, you consider a product like a phone carrier, right? Like there's, everyone differentiates from each other, but at the end of the day, all I really want is a phone that works.
mhm.
And if I perceive one carrier to be better at security than the next one, my switching cost otherwise is relatively low, and I want to actually have that as a thing that I feel confident about, and that is factoring into my choice as a consumer at this point in time. I don't think every industry is necessarily like that. I do believe what I said before around the fact that like the general public is just kind of nervous about this stuff. Um, and they're aware of it in a way that wasn't true, 10 years ago. You,
Yeah,
you do
my
you,
concern
you
is
do
though
you do see it manifest in kind of these like really broad, like commoditized markets where it's
right,
something that
right.
everyone has to have. Like that's where you see it show up because there's so much competition.
Yeah. I don't know, I think of, like, my friends and neighbors that aren't in technology, and they'll switch carriers just to save $50 a month,
Yeah,
right? And that's price still seems to be the
yeah.
driver,
No, hence
I
hence
think, of the
hence
general population,
hence
right?
my caveat. I don't think it's a top
Mm,
line. I don't
Yeah.
think it's a
mm,
top line item for most folk just yet, but it's definitely there in the mix. And going even to what you just said there, like if price is the main driver, the less differentiation there is on price, the more these other things can actually appear
Yeah.
in the buying decision for the consumer. So it
right,
matters.
well, you take an extreme example, I don't think everyone's going to AliExpress and buying a $37 Android device like I did, which is just for
But
security
Paul
testing,
did.
not to actually use as a phone.
Your
In
Honor.
the
Yeah,
general, when I put it on social media, everyone's like, "So how much malware did you find so far?"
yeah,
Like, still digging, but
yeah. Who's it phoning home to? Yeah, nice.
right.
Yeah, it's funny though on that consumer perspective. The way I kind of see it is there's a general sense now of security matters in the consumer population, the non-technical consumer population. So there's sort
Yep,
of this vague sense of ill at ease that they don't know
yep.
how to appease, and the right company
Mhm.
coming in with the right messaging can be the appeasing of that,
Precisely. I
you
think
know?
that's 100% right. Like I'm known to say that like security is at its core, at a market level, a design and a marketing problem. It's a marketing problem in the sense that you want to make secure and the ability to be secure as obvious as you can. And you also, from a design standpoint, want to make it as easy as you can possibly make it. Especially for these kind of ill at ease, non-technical consumers that don't really understand what's going on. Like you're not going to hit them over the head with a ton of jargon and have it land. You just want them to feel, like they've been able to make some sort of proactive decision that helps them manage their risk posture. And that's a marketing problem in a lot of ways. It's helping them understand that, like, yeah, there are ways for you to do that. They're not a silver bullet. It doesn't mean that you're never going to get hacked. It does mean that you've made a decision that's potentially like altering your risk posture on the internet in a positive way. And if that's something that concerns you, then putting that in front of them in a way that's obvious, I think that's a really powerful thing for companies to do at this point.
I'd love to see cell carriers compete on who's the most difficult to SIM swap, right? I think that would be a great place to get to.
Yeah, Yeah, I mean, before that, we need to have the general public, better aware of the actual SIM swapping threat
Yeah.
to them personally. Like, I think
Right.
at this point in time, like the average person is concerned about their identity getting stolen. They're concerned about their bank account getting drained. Like, there's different things that sort of like, oh, that'd be bad, and that's an impact
Mhm.
that I want to avoid. Yeah, the paths to that, I don't think they're as
Yeah.
universally aware of those things, and that's where SIM swapping would probably pop up. But the general idea of like, yeah, we're trying to make this shit hard so that you guys can just get on with like life and not worrying about bad guys on the internet. I think that's
Mm.
a pretty useful message to take out to market at this point in history.
Yeah.
Changing gears a little bit, Casey, are there so I guess we have to answer this question first. Are there not as many bug bounties on firmware-based, hardware-based devices as they are in, like, all the other software that exists in the world?
Yes.
And why so but why what are the challenges there? Like, what's the reasons why,
Yeah.
in
Well,
your opinion?
I think probably the first thing is that web is just really easy
Yeah,
to do.
because it's there, it's accessible, right?
Yeah,
It's made to be accessed. A website exists so that I can go access it, right?
exactly. So if you're able to access it in that way as a user, then you're able to access it in that way as a tester.
Right.
Testing become like the logistics around like just starting off hunting, bug bounty on a application platform somewhere. It's kind of almost zero cost
Mhm.
to do that for the person on the research side. And what that leads to is that there's a lot more material around, a lot more kind of educational kind of content. There's larger communities, all those different things to be able to plug into to learn. So folk can skill up, like
Mhm.
accessibility to skills and training and all those different things in web, I think is just kind of universal and ubiquitous at this point. So that's why there's more of those. And it's important to call out because I think we are contrasting the two. It's not just that there's not a lot of hardware. It's like there's a lot of everything else, and that makes this look smaller.
Right,
Yeah,
Um,
right.
I would argue that part of the difference too is if you add up all the firmwares and BIOSes and UEFIs and all those things out there in the world, you get this huge stack. And then you add up
yeah,
all the web applications, you get this huge stack. The difference is across all that hardware and firmware and BIOS and UEFI and everything else, each one is a discrete, unique thing versus every one of those webs has a commonality of technology behind it. And
yeah,
I
that's
think that's one of the differences too, because population wise, there's probably parity there, right?
yeah. I think that's right. I think there's when you're attacking something that you can pick up and hold in your hands, whether it's firmware or like an installed binary on a mobile app or source code or whatever else it might be, you've kind of got to start to look at it from the inside out instead of from the outside in, which is a lot of what like dynamic web app testing ends up looking like. You're kind of looking for symptoms of issues. You're looking for kind of proxy indicators of shittiness ultimately, and then following the rabbit down the rabbit hole to try to get an outcome, right?
Mhm.
Whereas with firmware testing, with anything that involves like something that you've like got in your possession, you kind of your first step is to take an X-ray of it and look at it from the outside, from the inside out rather. So you're
Yeah.
starting at the bottom and kind of doing that type of thing, which is a heavier process if you don't have as a researcher your tooling set up for that. If you don't have your kind of mental models for your workflows that you apply to offense, as mature around that type of thing, it's just it's slower, I guess is what I'm saying. Um, and yeah, like, I think what ends up happening is you end up with these, the folk that we invited to this event, like I've been watching them tear apart hardware for, gosh, since 2017. So like, what is that? 7 years at this point. And they're all, 17, 18 years old when we first kind of met getting into automotive security. So like they've built out their own workflows, they know what tools are going to be most effective to their own style of offense. And they know what kind of targets are most interesting to them. They know what their peers know, so they can buddy up in the way that I was talking about before. There's all these different kind of aspects that they've ultimately built out over that period of time that makes this group very good at what they do. That's just not as common as it is for web. So
Yeah.
yeah, but I mean, Paul, going back to your question, like why aren't there more hardware bounties?
Mm.
It's partly, I don't think that it's supply constrained. I do think if there was more, then more hardware hackers would kind of appear, because there
Yeah.
is
Yep.
definitely a marketplace kind of supply demand thing that kicks in
Right.
with bounty just in general, right? And I
Well,
do
'cause,
know that there's a lot of people out there that can do this stuff.
you've evangelized the incentive,
Yeah,
right? The incentive is that researchers get paid.
Yeah.
So if there was more hardware bounties, we'd be like, oh, when you come a little
It'd be
more
like,
up to speed on
oh, that's
hardware,
more.
because
Yeah. It's
I'm
like
going to get paid.
the ones that are already good at it that aren't active, you'd engage them, and then the ones that aren't good at it yet but feel like they could be, you'd activate them as well.
Yeah.
So that's
Right.
there's a supply demand kind of curve that just kicks in regardless of the technology that we're talking about. That's been true this entire time.
My concern, if I'm a hardware or device manufacturer, right? Because typically I'm not going to manufacture my own hardware, right? It's going to come from it's going to come from China, and going to put it together inside of a product. Is
Yep.
if in a bug bounty there's an issue that's found that I can't fix without new hardware, which happens, right? And I
It
don't
can,
want to
yeah.
shame anyone. Like it happens. Like we can't predict every single vulnerability that's going to happen on any particular platform. It's going to happen. Is it just fear on the manufacturer side of that scenario, or like how do you? And I guess the question is, how do you coach your customers on those scenarios, because it's not just specific to hardware?
Yeah, definitely. There's the ODM problem. So
Mhm.
in terms of the programs that we run, like just publicly at the moment, what is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So there's 10 programs that are running that are public on the Bugcrowd platform right now that I can sort by and just see.
Mhm.
And that's ranging from Cisco Meraki, talking about
Mhm.
enterprise kit, like Tesla is up on there,
Mhm.
right through to there's a consumer like Comcast. So like looking at like
Mhm.
literally routers and kind of home like IoT type stuff. All of these organizations in various forms rely on ODMs to do their coding for them. Um,
Mhm.
Especially the ones that are doing kind of smaller products that they're trying to create
Yeah.
a lot of,
What's your
right?
definition of ODM in this context, Casey?
So it's basically like an outsourced outsourced device manufacturer, but it's essentially like your design, your engineering, your software development, all those different pieces. There's components, or even sometimes all of that kind of
Mhm.
outsourced to a third party,
Yep.
right? And as the mothership organization, what you're doing is product management and like
Yeah. Yeah.
telling them what you need from a consumer and a market standpoint, and they go off and kind
Right.
of build it, right? You do some
Yeah.
QA, and then off it goes out to market. So
Yeah.
that can work really well. Sometimes that actually introduces a lot of, like, I think a lot of the really hairy stuff that we saw in IoT back in like 2015, 2016 was that like the whole thing was being fully thrown over the fence and just like they'll take care of it, and they kind of
Mhm.
weren't.
Right.
Um,
Right.
that's less common now, but still a thing. But what it does introduce, going back to your point, is this idea of a ping time between a vulnerability being fixed, like the mothership becoming aware of that, and then having to
Mhm.
go back and forth with this third party organization that might be in some other
Right.
part of the world to get the thing fixed. So there's that part. Then you've got to go off and actually deploy the patch or the mitigation, or in some cases, kind of going back to what you said before, if there's a hardware change that's needed,
Mhm.
that creates a much bigger logistical issue at that point
Yeah,
in
and
time.
as Josh Corman said, explained to me this really interesting concept based on U.S. law, that the I think he called it the last line supplier. I mean, I always say the phrase wrong, but there's a court case from like 1915 where there was wooden tires on a Buick and there was an accident, and they're like, well, Firestone should fix that. And the U.S. law was basically like, you're the last line
Yeah.
supplier, therefore it's your responsibility. So I can see that hesitation translating to your technology company. You're producing this product, even though some of the components of the supply chain
And
have
we're not
issues.
fully in control of what's in the product,
Yeah,
but we're going to get our
but you're
asses kicked if there's a
responsible
problem. Yeah.
because, look, case law has proven you're responsible because you are the company that produced that good and made the good available to market.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, I mean, even without that case law, you've got the marketing component of that.
Mhm.
Like
Yeah, it could look bad. Yeah,
you're just going to look bad. And like if you go out and say it wasn't us, it was our OEM or our
yeah.
ODM,
Now you're the
like,
Spider-Man meme when you're just
yeah,
pointing fingers at.
well, and and your consumer base, like especially if you're B2C, your consumer base isn't even going to necessarily understand what you're saying.
Right.
Like
Right, right.
if you're B2E, they're probably not going to care because of the case law component of it. But it's just
Mhm.
one of those things where you're ultimately on the hook because it's your brand.
Yeah.
That's kind of the last line in the purchase order. So
It's funny to
there's a lot
me.
of different things that kind of slow it down. I think
Mm.
fixing can be difficult. It's definitely a lot easier to fix push something up into a platform and have it change in one spot because you're running a hosted platform. Like that's
Yeah.
easy
Yeah.
versus
Yeah.
like we've got
Software's so much easier to fix than
Yeah.
this hardware and firmware stuff, right? I've
yeah.
said that in my previous talks. Like we just gotta face facts. Like it's just a lot
And
easier to fix
Logistically,
software.
it's a lot harder to solve this problem.
A and there's
Yeah.
companies that hamstring themselves, right? Like, I'm not gonna name the manufacturer, but there's a certain PC manufacturer who has 2 lines of laptops, for example. One is designed for the enterprise, one is designed for the consumer.
Right.
The guarantee with the enterprise is that you're gonna get the same components and same parts and pieces over the course of X years or whatever, and so the IT department knows it's truly the same hardware. I order a new one a year from now, it's gonna act and operate exactly like the one I ordered a year ago, versus the consumer one is all over the map, and they may be changing chips on the daily basis even, right?
Yeah.
Well, that consistency guarantee, what if that's the one that needs a parts replacement? Like, you've just violated your
Mm,
own paradigm, right?
Yep. Yeah. So, it's just harder. Is kind of going back to your original question, Paul. I think that's the
yeah.
answer. Is it's just logistically more difficult. Like that said, the internet doesn't care.
Right.
You
The threat
know,
actors certainly don't care. I mean, to the threat actors, this works in their advantage. I think the trend I'm witnessing now is vulnerabilities in IoT devices that are end of life have exploits written, and the threat actors like this is
yeah,
great. Like people
it's
actually can't. I mean,
party time. Yep.
you don't want to say can't patch, right? Because if you really put some effort into it, you might be able to mitigate some of these vulnerabilities. If you were to take the firmware apart, fix some things, and then put it back together, but that's a length. I mean, I've done some of that stuff before. It can be a lengthy process, and it doesn't always work.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. So ultimately, what I think it comes down to, you look at, there's IoT regulation that's being proposed and passed in different parts of the world. I think that, the idea of there being like, certifications. Excuse me.
Yeah, what are they? Are
I
they calling
forget
it
the
the
name.
cyber trust? Is it the cyber trust mark that they're calling for IoT? I know there was a in
There's,
years past because I've had the guests on my show because it interests me with IoT stuff and firmware,
yeah,
and I've had multiple guests come on and say we're looking for this label or standard that we're going to put on these IoT devices, similar to a UL rating that you would have in your
Energy
dishwasher or
Star.
whatever,
yep,
Energy Star, right?
yep,
And
yep.
we're going to put that on IoT devices, and we're going to make consumers care about the security of these things by putting this sticker on. And I'm still skeptical.
It's, I mean, likewise, because like the question in my mind would be, what does it say? And how do you have that? How do you have that
Right.
be something that can be actually understood and
Yeah.
actions by
It
a
says
buyer?
it's
Kind of going
secure,
back to what we said
Casey.
before.
It's secure,
Oh,
right?
tick.
It's
Okay, we're good to go.
right. Take the box. It's
Um,
secure. What does that mean?
well,
What is
the
three of
other,
us know that all of us listening, right? All know that secure is an overloaded term. What does that really mean?
yeah. So there's definitely, like, I've actually been involved in some of that stuff from a policy creation standpoint in terms of what goes into that. Because the other thing is that security, from a vulnerability standpoint, it's temporal. Like we actually
Mm,
don't know what we don't know, and
right.
to say that we've like certified it as secure at a particular point in time, like how long does that point in time actually last for before it expires? Like that's a really difficult problem to solve with hardware in particular. I think just
Mm,
generally it's kind of hard, but with this stuff it's particularly difficult. So okay, in its place, what should we be saying? What, how should we be thinking about this type of thing? There's a lot of work going into, I think there's a lot of pressure. This is kind of what I was getting to before.
hmm
There's just a general sense of pressure on solving that problem that's coming from a policy and a legislative standpoint. I think, from a hardware manufacturer, um, like putting myself in their shoes, it's probably a good idea to be thinking about through those like glasses, if that makes sense. It's like, okay, I'm going to
hmm
need to deal with this. I can't just avoid this in perpetuity. It's a thing that I'm going to at least have to have some sort of response to at some point in the future. So even though it's difficult, even though I have to deal with ODMs and chipsets and God knows whatever else, EOL, blah blah blah, um, I need to start to think about how I do this on a sustainable basis going forward. Assuming that between now and the heat death of the universe, you're going to be called to, and it actually won't
Right.
be a choice at that point in time.
I think there could be an economic and cost component to it in that there's decisions about what component should we include in my IoT device. Well, this component we can send down software updates more easily and for a longer period of time and support more functionality. But that design is $5 more expensive per device. And since we're, producing a million of these, that's not an insignificant cost.
Yeah,
And so I think some of it is economics too.
Yeah, and there's definitely been IoT kind of standard practices guidelines released over the past couple of years, mostly around consumer stuff,
Yeah.
like not using default passwords, making sure you got auto update, like all of the simple, the things that should be simple but that kind of
Mhm.
need to be said. Um, we've not seen necessarily the enterprise version of that pop out yet, but
Yeah.
that's being worked on as well. So the idea of like what are the foundational kind of starting point, what does basic hygiene look like here? And how do we put some sort of control mechanism on vendors actually attaining that level of baseline hygiene in how
Yeah.
they do this? How can we use that to kind of just raise the tide a little bit, and then we can just continue to iterate on that.
Yeah,
Mhm.
historically, the manufacturing companies, and I've worked at them. I've sat there and watched the motherboards flying down the assembly line and the chips getting installed. And
Yeah.
if you look at it, there's a production manager whose sole job is to source cheaper chips that do the same thing.
Yeah.
That's all they're
Mhm.
doing is just, hey, this one from the Philippines, we've got a new one from China, does the exact same thing for 0.01 cents cheaper per unit. These kinds of things matter. Then you get the engineering and QA and failure rates and these kinds of measurements that are all part of the calculus as well. The failure rates team and the engineers can come back and say, hey, I get that chip's a little cheaper, but we've seen too many of them blow up. It's not worth it. Here's the metrics on that. You don't hear
Mm.
about the security metrics being integral to the flow of that assembly line the same way.
Yeah.
You just don't. Still,
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
don't.
I think it needs to be part of the safety conversation though, Alan,
Yeah.
Yes.
to your point, right?
Yes. That is
Yeah.
precisely it.
No, well, and it needs to be measurable. There needs to be enough agreement around.
Mhm.
I honestly think that's a major sticking point that we've got with security metrics and trying to standardize those things, because it's like, how long's a piece of string? Like if you're talking about performance of
Right.
of a particular thing, like that's time. Like time is fairly well agreed on, and time being shorter from a performance standpoint, that's fairly well agreed on as the goal. So therefore, if it's less, then we've got a direct kind of ROI calculation we can make at that point. Those sorts of things don't really exist in that same way for security.
Yeah,
Um,
and I'm not picking on vendors here, but the other side of the economic coin is, um, I believe Barracuda and CISA recommended the Avanti platforms that you replace the hardware, right? And so that's a cost on both sides,
yeah,
right? That's a cost to the provider, the manufacturer of that gear, and that's a cost to the customer. And by having a more secure by design, secure by default, which is also something CIS is pushing for, we can alleviate those costs that may come down the road. The other cost is if it's vulnerable and then there's a ransomware attack, that cost is on the customer. So how do we, we need to get ahead of it? Is it regulation? Is it pressure from the consumers? In this case, the enterprise is the consumer. Likely both, right?
yeah, yeah. I think so. Like whatever we've got available to use on that side of things. Like in this case, again, it's you've got a retail brand that's got consumer pressure that's made its way back into an enterprise networking brand. And like that to me is actually a pretty decent pattern for how it could work. And we saw a similar thing
Mhm.
happen. Again, I keep on harping on automotive, but to me, that's one of these areas where it's safety critical. Like
Yeah.
5G and these different kind of core infrastructure components, they're critical infrastructure, and you could argue that they are safety critical in a lot of different contexts. So I sort of see them in a similar bucket, even though one's a car and one's not. Um,
Hmm.
but that's how we saw it work with automotive. There was consumer pressure on your automotive brands, because all of a sudden people realize that connected vehicles have the internet inside them and bad things can happen. So the
Right.
brands started putting pressure downstream on their OEMs, and as a result, the entire supply chain, over time, got better as a
Right.
product of that.
Well, what's interesting is I saw some EV charging station hacking happen recently. And to your point in critical infrastructure, I think increasingly I would consider that critical infrastructure as we become a little more reliant over time on electronic vehicles. Those charging stations are critical. If it goes down, I mean, you can create some chaos,
Yeah.
right? If we play those scenarios out in our mind.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Well, you look at that in terms of food transportation, and
Yep.
like those kind of core, like your more traditional, like safety impacting CI kind of verticals, like that's a pretty obvious negative consequence. and then you just get into day-to-day transport, like oil and
Right.
gas. Oil and
Yep.
gas is critical infrastructure. Why is that? It's because it gets us places and it gets our things places. I think you're probably right. That'll probably merge at some point, which will be fun.
Right. It's interesting you mentioned Tesla, and I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about my experience because I have a Tesla.
Right.
And recently they gave a 30-day free trial to the fully automated self-driving. And you want to talk about freaking your family out? I'm just letting the car drive by itself. Like, you're still going to keep pressure on the wheel
Yeah.
in some capacity, but you can kind of mess with that. And so the car drives by itself. And I'm like, wow, I hope they have a bug bounty. I hope they've really tested the software. I hope that there's security things that are happening here, safety thing. Like, it's scary, man. It made a lane change like on its own. Like, it just freaks me out.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they started their program. When was that? It was 2014, I think it was.
Mhm.
And this is pre, Charlie and Chris. So
Mhm.
Charlie and Chris at DEF CON with the Jeep stuff, that was when the
Yeah.
rest of
Yep.
the automotive industry went, oh shit, like we should like really get onto this. Tesla, to their credit, were ahead of that. I think, largely because they kind of viewed themselves as a software company at the
Yeah.
time. It's like
Yeah.
we're a software company that produces cars, and that was their sort of mindset and their overall approach. So,
I
you know,
think it still is. I think their automated driving is, from what I've heard, is like they look at that as the future of the company.
yeah, I mean, I would be inclined to agree with that, and as a result of that, like you've got to have. I mean, the thing that I love, like there's a vuln that came through that we can talk about publicly,
Mhm.
where basically it was, a Chinese crew found a bug in Tesla from, I think, the submission of that vulnerability to basically an OTA patch being deployed to their entire fleet. It was something in the order of like 20 days, 21 days.
Nice.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, for
which
the
is
entire fleet,
extraordinary.
that's real. Yeah, that's really good.
You think about all the shit that has to go into making that happen,
Yep.
including the planning ahead to make sure that you've got OTA in the first place to actually do that. Like
Yeah, to actually do.
that to me
Yeah.
is a byproduct of some of this stuff, because it's not so
And the
much
regression testing on every
all of
version
it.
of every car, and
Yep.
yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And they could, Tesla were in a good position to do that, I think partly because they're vertically integrated in ways that other automotive manufacturers aren't as much.
Mhm.
But just the OTA component of it, and just thinking ahead, like, part of the reason for that is that they'd seen hackers break their stuff this entire time, and they knew that this is a thing that happens sometimes. So like that creates greater confidence in the self-driving, things that they're doing like now and going into the future, because the consumer knows that if there's a problem with this stuff, they're just going to fix it. Um, like there has to be a confidence in that for that to be adopted in the first place. So there's all these kind of causalities in the market that I always get kind of nerdy about, because to me they're ultimately, I think, a lot of what will drive security as an industry going forward. We can't just like stand on the street corner and scream and say it's broken to people, because sometimes they don't care, right? It's
Right.
like, okay,
Yeah, but
where
I
do
think it's
you
a
care,
good.
and how do we tie those things together to get a better outcome?
It's interesting. It's a great model because Tesla customers are accustomed to getting these over-the-air software updates, applying them, and and it tells you right in the update, your car's not going to be drivable for 20, 30 minutes, right? So you schedule them, and it comes down all the time, and you're accustomed to that. Like, why can't we have the same thing on our network devices, appliances, and and things that we're putting in our enterprise that we rely
Yeah.
upon for things like access, for things like
Windows.
communications? Yeah, Windows is a great example. Actually, I think it's a great shining example of that. So you've
Mhm.
got Tesla and Microsoft that are big enough to make that happen for their customers. How do we trickle that down into all the other manufacturers that we have this gear?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when you're talking about enterprise networking equipment and
Hmm.
things like that, it's always going to come back to availability. Like
Yeah.
that was a big shift in IoT, 2015, 2016, when we realized that like this is a shit show. Like we're going to need
Hmm.
to do a lot of patching because it's bad out there. And this whole idea of it being default, like self-updating, like it just happens at 3 a.m. It's a
Hmm.
thermostat. Who cares? It'll be fine.
Right.
Like, when that's true, it's not a problem, and you can just kind of make that decision as a vendor. But if you've got, something that's sitting in the middle of a high availability cluster, then
Yeah.
that creates an
It's
issue.
different. The operational impact and the operational risk is much greater.
Yeah,
And you
I
got a VPN appliance and there's 10,000 users on it.
exactly.
yeah.
Yep.
I spent a stay in the hospital recently, and I hadn't been in a hospital in 10, 15 years or something now. It's been a long time since I've hung out on one and just clocked all the internet connected devices that were monitoring me, that were part of the process, that were there all the time, the ones that were in the hands of the staff. You can't push updates to any of that stuff.
Yeah.
You don't wanna take somebody's heart rate monitor down. You don't wanna take somebody, like all these. I was just sitting there the whole time thinking, "Oh my god, what an attack surface."
Yeah. Yeah, and it's why you still see, Windows CE and Windows XP bouncing around in healthcare all the time. It's because like
Mhm.
that issue when it comes to just updating being hard, and then you got the issue of companies going out of business. Roughly, you can sort of tell when that happened, because it's the last like set of DLLs that their middleware will actually interoperate with, so that you're stuck on that operating system in perpetuity until you churn off. There's, I mean,
Yep.
it's a messy set of problems to kind of unpick. But I think going back to kind of what we did with Timo and thinking about it through an exploitation lens, I think making sure that those stories are told and that they're understood and that the right people are in the room to be able to actually do something about them. It's the same as it's been with just about everything else. I think that's often the starting point, because if it works, people won't touch it.
Right.
And like it's got to have a controlled trash fire of some description before people get off their butt and actually do things about it, because that's just kind of how security works, right?
And we've made strides with medical equipment.
Yeah.
It's my wife was in labor once, and we had the heart rate monitor just get hooked up for the baby, and I looked up at the screen. She's like, "Look, it's the baby's heartbeat." And I'm like, "Is that Windows 98?" And I put that out on Twitter, and that sparked a whole conversation. And thankfully, to people like Josh Corman and many others, right, that push for this legislation, we came out, I think, ahead in this particular case,
Yeah.
where security is taken into account before devices are approved
Yep.
for medical use. And
Mhm.
I truly believe we're going to get regulation, whether we like it or not, for
And I think
pretty
it'll
much
start there in
everything else.
healthcare. I think
Yeah,
it'll start in
and it already
healthcare.
has.
Yep.
Mm.
Yeah.
And so I guess the other point is, if we're not involved, it's going to happen with or without us, and so we should be involved. And that's a great segue, Casey. You're involved with the Hackers on the Hill. I remember seeing you like at ShmooCon, and you were like, "Oh, I'm just coming off like Hackers." I'm like, "What is that? That sounds cool."
Yeah. No, like I've been pretty actively involved in policy shaping. Yeah, like the two. I've said this a couple of times before on the show, so not to belabor it, but like the two reasons I started BugCrowd was to basically create an economic advantage for defenders that doesn't exist, because there's lots of them. One versus many is going to fail. So how do we get many on the defensive side as well? That was kind of the core of the idea. But then the other was to really, make some moves in changing the operating environment for people to hack in good faith. Because historically, like coming into it, it's not just the perception of hackers; it's the legal kind of environment for it. We've had to fight against, being basically presumed to be criminal for like a really long time. And that's only really shifted, with the charging rule changes that happened with the CFAA in, I think it was May of 21, that came through. And that, that was a result of like 6 years of pretty relentless campaigning and kind of education, all those different things. So, Hackers on the Hill is an opportunity for technologists to get involved in actually having conversations with policymakers to help them understand, like literally just go in there, like let them ask you dumb questions, ask them dumb questions about policy, because we don't understand that as well as they do. Like the interesting thing I think about a lot of those types of events is that at this point in time, legislators really do want to hear from us. And I think a lot of the time people in the technology space don't actually recognize that that's true. Like, oh, they'll never listen to me. I'm just a nerd. Like they're up on the hill doing policy things and blah, blah, blah. Whereas in reality, they're like, we don't have a fucking clue what you guys do, and we need to, because we actually want to try to do this well. Like, can we engage and have a meaningful discourse so we can create, legislation that doesn't have unintended consequences associated with it and different things like that. So that's why I've been involved in that for a long time, because obviously, my role in that with BugCrowd in particular is kind of sitting at the intersection of the community and kind of where it plugs into the market. The policy environment plays a pretty critical role in the success or the failure of that, which is why I kind of got busy with it back in the day and continue to be involved in that stuff.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Casey, do you have any other hackathons coming up?
We've got a couple.
I call them hackathons. I don't know if you call them something different.
Yeah.
That's just the moniker I gave them.
Hackathons, like live hacking events, bug bashes. We do. We've got a couple actually coming up that we're going to be running in Vegas, and I think there's a couple slated for Q3 of this year as well. Like they're interesting because they're not the kind of thing you can do. Like there's a lot that goes into making these events successful. So we're not kind of running them constantly, but we do them, roughly once a quarter, once every 2 quarters or so.
But as a researcher, if you want to be involved, you have to be invited to most of these. So be involved in the bug bounty, program, and then hopefully, if you have the right skills and you're lucky, you get invited.
Yeah, look, for the hardware audience, really what it comes down to is signing up on the platform. I think for folks that kind of have like really specialist skills in these areas and want to apply them, reaching out to someone in the support team. Like I'm on Twitter, talking shit most days. So like there's obviously opportunities to. That's what it's for, right? But also to connect and create opportunities for folk to actually highlight the fact that I've been doing this thing for a really long time. Like you might not know me, but I could potentially be valuable and useful to it. Feeling free and welcome to do that type of thing. But yeah, just signing up for the platform is step 0. Making sure that that the platform itself actually understands that you're very focused on the hardware side of things. There's your bio sections and interests and things that you can kind of connect into your profile that gives us a better understanding of what you're good at and what you've done in the past. That's really how to get started on that stuff. And there's going to be more of these as we roll along. So I would encourage anyone who wants to do that to do it.
Awesome. Well, Casey, thank you so much for appearing on Below the Surface today.
Thanks for having me. Good to chat.
Alan, always a pleasure. And thank you everyone for listening and watching, and we'll see you next time.